It's been a while since I've talked about the FNAF TCG on my channel, so before I get into FNAF 3, I want to cover just some of the quality of life changes and improvements I've made to the game since then. I'm not going to go over any changes or balance patches that happened to cards that were not in those first two videos. I'm just going to cover those new cards as they are right now, as if they were always like that, and ignore the fact that there are some things like Springtrap being able to spawn out of thin air for 10%. A 10% you gained, by the way, not a 10% you spent. Those didn't exist, they never happened, because I haven't mentioned Springtrap yet. Alright, so one of the first things I want to cover is the design overhaul. JJ Robotnik helped a lot with redoing how the cards looked between releases. In that very first video, the cards used the beta design rather than the new gamma design. The beta design was pretty fugly in hindsight. I like a lot of the concepts I was going for. The power module no longer exists in the abstract void and is really large, and instead now actually looks like a power module with a actual glowing LED on it rather than a magical orb or whatever the first design was. The text boxes now have this very nice little checkerboard behind them. The main card image is an actual rectangle rather than the weird thing with a cut notch in it that it was before. The JP text is now a much more standardized red splash that doesn't change size with every card. A lot of this text is just more standardized across the board with how it's scaled and sized and made a lot more consistent and a lot easier to read. A lot of the art had overalls to look actually somewhat decent, or at least look a little bit better than just random two sprites slapped on a black background. And JJ Robotnik implemented one of my favorite changes to any of the cards, which was the map in the bottom left corner. In the original beta designs, I just wrote out where the cards were meant to go every single time. But god, just seeing where the card goes is so much better and allows for a lot more creativity when it comes to designing cards. Seriously, so many shoutouts to JJ Robotnik for designing so many great little ideas. Another change was that every card now has a background that's unique to the game it comes from. For example, FNAF 1 has the black static that was on the title screen and very iconic there. FNAF 2 cards have the Save Them tiles in the background. FNAF 3 has the extra menu weird yellow-green gradient thing that references the weird tiling of the walls in the game. FNAF 4 has the red static that occurs whenever you die and also kind of references the title screen. FNAF World has the flip side as its background. Sister Location has pipes and machinery. FNAF 6 has the deluxe tile set background. Ultimate Custom Night has the weird neon grid things that are on the title screen. And then a lot of the remaining cards just had unique things I made up for each card. A lot of the core spirits have this weird kind of rendition of the FNAF 3 tile background, but with colors matching each character. And some cards I just outright made something up entirely, such as Funtime Foxy Mangle having this fancy star background that references the golden days of the EX cards in Pokemon with kind of weird dotted retro look. The other reason Mangle is associated with stars in this art is Mangle's my favorite character and I like stars, but also the Mangle's Quest minigame occurs in this weird space world background, so I kind of associate the two that way. Now, the gamma designs were used in the FNAF 1 and 2 breakdown video, but I actually wrote that video and recorded everything with the original beta cards originally, but then right before I finished the video I was able to switch all the assets to the gamma designs and was able to render it with that, and it just kind of worked and I ran with it, but I never acknowledged the fact that they changed between the videos. And because all the cards are now cleanly organized with their backgrounds to what game they go to, there's some cards that I just didn't straight up acknowledge as FNAF 1 cards at the time, or FNAF 2 cards. For example, the fan! It's a blanket nerf effect that makes it so cards cannot deactivate to use their effects. This applies to both sides of the board, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but for cards like Toy Freddy or Rockstar Bonnie or a lot of the adventure characters who all use deactivations, it's a great way of limiting the power scale of what's on the board at the moment. Hallucinations were added, referencing FNAF 1's weird whatever these are screens, and it's a basic way to shut down human cards. But I would argue just killing them or removing them with card effects is better than just limiting what they can do. And this was a big one that people wanted for a while. Cameras. Cameras does is it reveals the top two cards of both players' decks, so both of you know what will happen next. It's simple, it's not exactly a game-changing new addition that will be meta in every deck, but I'm sure someone can find some deck where it'll work great. Okay, here's a FNAF 2 card that I was actually very excited to add into the game. Flashlight. It removes two counters from a card on the map. It can be your card, your opponent's card, whatever. If you haven't really put together what counters are across the videos, a counter just means a literal counter of whatever status effect is on a card. For example, Foxy places a +1 JP counter on himself. That is a status change where he has +1 more JP. You can have 2 of those for +2 JP, and so on. By playing Flashlight, you could remove that +2 JP you got, thus limiting what your opponent's Foxy card was capable of. This can also be useful for removing debuffs on your card. Let's say you have a -1 counter on one of your cards. You can flash it to remove that counter. This is really great in a situation where the status changes are really getting to your board, though it doesn't work on cards outside of the map. So counter builders like Glitch Trap or the Puppet cannot be slowed down by the Flashlight. Alright, the damn rabbits. The Bonnie archetype as a whole was busted for ages. It felt like no matter what changes or limitations I implemented, it was clear that the Bonnie archetype just was too powerful by concept. This should be pretty obvious in hindsight with basic card advantage. Card advantage is a pretty universal concept. Let's say that me and my opponent are perfectly matched in a TCG. Every card we have is perfectly countered by a card they have. And in theory, we would perfectly tie and draw by the end of the game if every one of our 5 cards is countered by their 5 cards, and so on. However, let's say that some effect gives me 8 extra cards, so I have 6 cards. Well, by the time my cards all run out and counter my opponent's 5 cards, I will be left over with 1 card still standing, completely unopposed. Just having 1 more card, regardless of how balanced the game is inherently an advantage. Now, some TCGs limit this effect by making it so getting 1 extra card isn't that difficult. This can be felt in stuff like the Pokemon TCG or Digimon TCG, where card draw and advantage is much more common and switches up much more frequently. Likewise, the FNAF TCG isn't actually that brutal about card draw. It isn't common, but there are enough staple cards to make it not completely uncommon either. However, when this applied to the Bonnie deck, that entire concept of 1 card trades for 1 card no longer applied, because every Bonnie was trading beyond its weight class. That was the entire playstyle of the Bonnie archetype. Each Bonnie you have will take down multiple cards, or at least that they have to spend multiple cards to get rid of each individual Bonnie, because they are hard to remove and counter. Bonnie created this brutal environment and setup because he could attack active cards and could dumpster negative counters on any card he really wanted. In some instances, even when you kill the Bonnie, those counters would still be around, or you would still have to wait out the time limit for them to go away. It was this constant state where you would just get pummeled and beaten up constantly by Bonnie. While that was what I set out to do, what I set out to do was flawed and stupid. So hence, I have started an initiative I've nicknamed God Save the Rabbit. In other words, I'm making the Bonnies actually have to do strategy and stuff. This took quite a bit of customization and testing, and it's still not completely 100% refined as it is. But I'm going to use the 3 Bonnies I've already covered to explain how these changes have occurred in general. Firstly, we're going to entirely remove the attack active cards principle that Bonnie used to function under. This now means the only way for Bonnie to attack a card is if your opponent chooses to block, or your opponent had chose to do something with them, such as deactivate for an effect or attack, on their turn, which means you are punishing their decisions in this case. Basically, the only way for Bonnie to be proactive is to play around your opponent's decisions. Because they attacked last turn, you can kill their card because it's exposed and open. Or you can just throw out a basic attack knowing your opponent's cards are weaker in its path. But it's still your opponent's choice. Do I sacrifice this card knowing it's weaker, or do I just take the raw damage from Bonnie outright? This basically means that Bonnie is now an actual, game in this game, you know? He's not just pummeling your opponent and ripping away choice and freedom from them. Prior, Bonnie could place multiple counters across multiple cards. The amount of counters just depended on how many rabbits you had. I still like the idea that rabbit swarming was important to his identity. The idea of rabbits multiplying or being in giant groups is part of their kind of identity as an animal, so I wanted to reference that in the game some. But giving Bonnie more counters per 1 turn just was clearly unfair, especially compared to cards like Foxy, who need to build up their counters with 1 card at a time. Now, he can only place 1 -1 JP counter until the end of your turn, and he can only do so on a card whose base JP score is equal to or less than the number of rabbits you control. Thus means if you only have 1 Bonnie on your map, he can only place a -1 counter on a card with 1 JP or less. When you play a second card, he can now weaken cards with 2 JP or less, and so on. Since there are a maximum of 5 cards on your map, this inherently means that Bonnie, assuming you only play rabbits on your board, which is unlikely because there are cards like Fritz and Mike you want to use, can nerf cards up to 5 JP or less. This would mean that any card with 6 JP or more is completely free from the wrath of Bonnie. It also means you have to spend more cards and get more cards out to start getting those larger advantages going. Since most of the Bonnies are locked to the front row anyway, this means in general this effect will cap at around 3 JP. This means a lot of Bonnie's power really comes around from killing weaker cards or cards that have been slightly buffed, as it's base JP, not current JP. Because it still had 1 JP, it means you only need 1 Bonnie to still nerf that card. It also plays into what I intended the original Bonnie weakness to be in the first place. What I wanted his core weakness to be was that he never had a late game high JP beater. Freddy could get cards like Withered Freddy, who build up their JP a lot, or summons Golden Freddy, and Sheikah constantly peppers in effect damage and heals and all that. And Foxy can build up to 4 JP with his base card, or even further with support card. As part of this whole no longer attacking active cards change, Toy Bonnie now punishes deactivated cards instead of activated ones. That means he can only attack cards your opponent chose to use. Other than that, he's pretty unchanged. He actually wasn't that big of a problem in himself. Withered Bonnie also represents another change I went through, which was I used to have this whole obsession with, oh, the Bonnies will kill animatronics and Springlock specifically, meaning they have a weakness to cards that are not those 2 types. Except that meant the Bonnies were really hard to balance, because they would end up in circumstances where they would be completely flattened by some archetypes that did not use a lot of those types. While that technically balanced their win rate, that wasn't fun. It wasn't interesting. It wasn't like, oh, now I have to figure out how to counter cards that are outside my archetype. It was instead more like, ah, crap, I have nothing to do against these cards because they're not what my comfort zone is. There was no, I can work around the disadvantage to find a solution. It was just, I now have a disadvantage. So instead, Withered Bonnie now can place minus JP counters on deactivated cards. Combined with this passive, it now makes him the ultimate punisher, thus meaning his gameplay loop is a lot closer to how the game was originally intended to be balanced and function in the first place. His minus JP counter is also no longer basically permanent. For a while, he could literally just throw out -1 counters that never went away. Like, ever. You could just consistently nerf a card and there was nothing you could do about it without cards like Flashlight. Now, it only lasts until the end of your turn, once again with that whole idea of he has to be prolific on his turn and take advantage of these weaknesses and openings. And while I'll cover them as they are now for a lot of the later Bonnies, a lot of these changes went into those later cards too. Another card that had a similar nerf was with Fritz. See, I intended Fritz Smith to be a way for weaker cards to kind of hold their own against stronger cards in the late game. However, it quickly became clear that free +1 JP that was pseudo-permanent was just not going to work. So I tried to balance it by making it cost 20% power every time the effect was used. This did make it so people had to consider how they used Fritz's counters more, but what it actually ended up incentivizing was people getting to around 10 or 0% power, and then using the effect to power choke the opponent by placing them at 10 or 20%. Thus meaning they were up a JP on a main card, while the opponent was down a lot of power and didn't have a lot to do to counter it. So after quite a bit of trial and error, this is what I settled on. Instead of spending percent during your turn, you can place your once per turn counter free, but at the start of your opponent's turn, for every counter Fritz had created total, they gain 10%. And that's every turn. So by the time you have 3 counters built up with Fritz, you're bleeding 30% every turn to your opponent. So you're trading more JP for giving your opponent more resources to work with. Combined with Fritz being a bit of a glass cannon playstyle-wise, fitting the fact that he gets fired at for 1 day, and the fact that all of his counters go away when he dies, there's now a lot of choice with how you use Fritz and his self-KO abilities. Once again, the name of the game for me for balancing is choice. I am fine with strong effects as long as there is counterplay or strategy behind them. I'm not even sure gift boxes was in the first 2 videos, but what it does is that it makes it so until the end of your turn, when a card you control would be sent to the salvage, it will send gift boxes to the salvage instead, thus meaning a chosen card has to be killed twice before it fully actually goes away. Of course, it only lasts until the end of your opponent's turn, so it's not perfect, but if you control the puppet, it stays pseudo-permanently. In other words, until it actually is used up by blocking a death, it will stay into effect. Or you could just kill the puppet. Or you could put this effect on the puppet, thus giving the puppet itself a second life. The paper plate pals are now treated as human, rabbit, and bear design, which means they're a bit more flexible in terms of what you can use them for. For example, you can combine them with Ballora, who becomes aggressive if you control a humanoid. Or they can count for being more bears on your map, or rabbits on your map for effects. It kind of loosely references them having Mimic Ball in FNAF World, but it also references the fact that one's a humanoid, one's a bear, and one's a rabbit. It's pretty simple, but it gives them a little bit more to do in each deck. Withered Sheikah is still going through a little bit of experimentation. The whole discard the card from the top of your deck or multiple cards just wasn't working as a consistent cost to dealing 1 outright effect damage. Right now, as of recording this, what she does is that she requires you to discard a card from your hand, which means you're taking a bite out of your card advantage to deal damage. But I might change it to deactivation as the cost instead of discarding anything. Thus, you're taking away Withered Chica's ability to attack or block in exchange for dealing effect damage outright. I'll settle on that later down the road, I just thought I'd mention it. Another change was to the card Something Borrowed, Something New. The original version of it really wasn't practical at all, because you were basically just command trading a powerful, expensive Withered card for a much cheaper toy animatronic, which didn't really make a lot of sense, and there wasn't really a bonus for doing it. It wasn't like when you do that, it makes the toy animatronic as strong as the original. It just was like a trade-in effect for no reason. So now what it does is you discard a Withered animatronic to play a toy animatronic of the matching design from your deck. This now means you have a guaranteed target pretty much no matter what, as long as you don't have the toy animatronic already in hand, which if you already have the toy animatronic in your hand, you just play it, you know. So in other words, it's basically just a command way to quickly get a toy animatronic out into play for very cheap. Shadow Freddy got a pretty huge nerf. Prior to the balance change, he was able to kill pretty much any card he wanted, but now whatever card he has to kill in question has to have equal to or less JP than what he has currently. So in other words, you have to wait until late game where his passive makes him way stronger to use that removal effect, at least on more powerful cards. It still makes him really good counterplay to human cards that have 0 base JP or very low base JP, but it means he can no longer just be slammed down and stare at Golden Freddy until he explodes. A lot of these changes should be pretty self-explanatory or obvious. I drastically prefer when a fault or failure is because of your choice, or at least you have some way to manifest how it happens, rather than just having choice yoinked out of your hand every turn for an effect that you can't do anything about. You at least have some say in how it happens, so you're not completely screwed over with no choice in the matter at all. It's also worth noting that since video 1 and 2, all of FCG 2, the second set of the game, has been released. That set covers everything from FNAF AR to Help Wanted to Security Breach and Ruin and Help Wanted 2, as well as some of the Freddy in Space stuff. Of course, that's all way down the road from where we're at. The next video I have my sights set on is FNAF 3 with the introduction of Afton, Springtrap, the Phantoms, as well as some of the Happiest Day stuff. So we'll all get to that when we get to that. Bye.